Hi everyone. Welcome to this short course on Introduction to Artificial Intelligence and Machine Learning. We will look at what artificial intelligence or machine learning means, what are the different types, and how does a machine learning process looks like. So, what is machine learning or what is AI or artificial intelligence? So, we can define AI as a broad discipline that aims to create systems or programs capable of performing tasks that would typically require human intelligence. So, any program or any system that has tasks like learning, reasoning, and self correction can be generally called as artificial intelligence. And machine learning is a subset of AI. What this means is the term machine learning focuses on algorithms that allow machines to learn from data. So data is really important for machine learning to work. So, so machine learning enables systems to improve automatically through experience, that is by looking at this data without being explicitly programmed for each task. And then deep learning is actually another subset within machine learning. So what it utilizes is artificial neural networks. And these artificial neural networks, which are basically mimicking how the human brain works or the biological brain works, they excel at interpreting large and complex data sets. And then we have data science. Data science is a cross-disciplinary field that intersects with all of the above, that is AI, machine learning, and deep learning. As the name suggests, data science is basically looking at the data, understanding the data, and extracting meaningful insights, which is crucial for us to decide what kind of machine learning model to choose from and what to look out for in the data. Now, how does AI or machine learning differ from traditional programming? So in traditional programming, we have some input and then we have a computer program. And we can give this input to a computer program and then we get some output. Machine learning is a bit different in the way that we have inputs and then we have outputs and we want to figure out how do these inputs and outputs relate with each other, or what is the model that maps inputs to outputs. So essentially, a trained machine learning model is capable of finding pairs of input and output mappings. So let's take a look at a very simple example. Let's say our task, or let's say we face a problem, and the problem is we want to classify fruits. And the input for us is basically, let's say, the size, shape, color, and mass of the fruit. So these are called features or inputs. And then what we have is a data set or a training data. So training data means we have already mapped certain inputs and then outputs. So this is essentially like question and answers through which the machine learning model can learn from. So the task is basically to look at the size, shape, color, and mask and classify what kind of fruit it is. And so the machine learning model looks at the data set and learns from the existing data. And the next time we give some input to the machine learning model, which is size, shape, color, and mass, it can predict what kind of fruit that could be. So in the previous example, we saw a classification task, but there are different kind of machine learning methods or models available. So the first one is called supervised learning. We do this when, or we call a learning to be supervised learning when there is labeled data available. Labeled data means there are input and output definitions already available. And when this is available, we classify the model to be either a classifier model, which does classification tasks. So that is what we saw in the previous example. And then there is the regression task. Regression is used when we have a number range to predict. So in the last example, it was categories like apple, orange, banana, or so on. Regression is basically numbers, predicting certain numbers itself. So it is not always the case that we will always have an input and then an output. Sometimes we only have inputs, and then that kind of learning is called unsupervised learning, where we don't have labels, that we don't have outputs. And when this is the case, there are two different types, that is clustering and dimensionality reduction. So as the name suggests, clustering means if we have just a chunk of data based on certain characteristics, we cluster this data into different groups. Also, what is possible is dimensionality reduction. This means that we can figure out the most significant or most important data from a group of data and then eliminate the less significant ones. And then there is also reinforcement learning, which is a very special kind of learning. As the name suggests, we provide some kind of reinforcement to the model while it's learning. So we can understand this better by taking a look at a very simple examples. So we can classify first the machine learning type based on the data. So if we have input and output, that is, if we have features and labels, it's called supervised learning. If we have only input or features, we can do unsupervised learning. And in supervised learning, the first example that we saw was essentially a classification task where we had input, output, or features and labels, and then we wanted to just classify. And an example of simple example of unsupervised learning is, let's take the same fruit problem. So let's say we just have an unorganized, unlabeled data. If we give this data to a clustering algorithm or a clustering machine learning model, it will directly cluster similar data samples into different clusters. Now it will not tell us if it's apple or orange or banana. No, it will only cluster them into groups. And then under supervised learning, there is also another type called regression. In this example, you can see what is meant by predicting numbers. So let's say we want to predict the price of a house based on area and the rooms it has. In this case, our prediction would be just a number, and it's not a definite number. It can be over a range. And these kind of problems are called regression problems. And then we finally come to reinforcement learning, where it's essentially there is a model that's learning that's called agent. And then we are basically the environment where for every time the agent or the machine learning model learns properly, we give it some reward. And we also observe if it makes mistakes and then help it to correct its action. Um, Yeah, so these are basically the types of machine learning, and we will look at what kind of models are available in the later part of these videos. And now let's summarize, or let's see what are the steps of an ML process. So the first step is actually to get data and pre-process this data. Pre-process this data means remove unwanted data, clean the data, make sure it's in the right format and so on. And once we have a proper data, we then pick a suitable model for this, and then we train the model based on this data. And once the training is done, we have to validate. Validation means we want to figure out if the model is performing well. So what do we do? So usually for validation, we have another set of data for which we know input and output, or we know features and labels. But we give only the features to the trained model to see if it can predict properly. So this is exactly like an exam. So how one would study for an exam, and then when we go to the exam, it's a different set of questions, and we evaluate if we are able to come up with the right answer. So this is the validation step. And once we validate, that is when we know what's the accuracy, is the model performing really well. And once this is done, then the model goes into production. Production means from now on, there is no time for training or validation. You just give the data to the model and it has to predict. So these are actually real-time systems. So for example, the applications in our phone, which has AI, are basically models in production because when we give some task to it, it's performing and giving us the output directly. It's not going into some training or validation and so on. So these are basically the steps of a machine learning process. So if we now bring the context back to CAD, CAE, or engineering, we see that the data or the tasks that we deal in engineering has to come from CAE engineers. Those are computer-aided engineering engineers. So they run simulations or perform designs, and basically that is our data. And using this data, scientists will then figure out what to extract from this data, what kind of insights can we have, and so on. And then they will choose a suitable machine learning model, train the model, and give it back to the engineers so that they can use it into their day-to-day tasks. And as you can already see, one can already guess what kind of challenges exist in adopting machine learning. So the first one is data generation itself. How can we generate thousands of data? And the second, and a very synchronous challenge, is data quality. It's not sufficient if we just generate even millions of data. They have to be really useful. They have to really be of good quality. The third challenge is expertise. How do we know what kind of machine learning method to choose? How to know what kind of model to have, how to train it, and so on. And usually the fourth challenge is integrating this machine learning model into our already existing workflow. So let's say we have a Synera workflow. We can also build a machine learning model, but then how to make sure that everything fits together perfectly so that we reduce certain inefficiencies through machine learning. And this is where Synera comes to help us. So in Synera, you can easily do design exploration. That is, you can set up parameters, responses, and generate numerous data samples seamlessly. And we can also parallelly clean these data sets and prepare them for machine learning. So cleaning means we remove unwanted data, we make sure everything is consistent, and so on. And regarding the model itself, we have certain nodes that actually take in input outputs or inputs and then already give us a trained model. And again, since we are already building a Synera workflow, we can easily create a sub workflow that involves a machine learning process. And then we can link this workflow back into our main workflow. I hope this gave you a good introduction to machine learning and the idea of artificial intelligence. So in the previous video, we had a quick introduction to artificial intelligence, machine learning, types of machine learning, and so on. And now we will look at our first machine learning model, which is linear regression. So let's look at what is linear regression. So as the name already suggests, it's a regression problem, or it has the term regression, which means it's used to predict continuous range of numbers. So linear regression is essentially a statistical method that is used to model or find the relationship between a dependent variable and one or more independent variables. That is, we have one target, that is one input, and then one output. So let's look at this figure here, which actually shows how it works. So these blue points are the data, and usually they are basically a relationship between an input and an output. And what linear regression does is we want to predict a line that can statistically pass through all of the points. And this line is represented by the very famous slope equation, which is y equal to mx plus b. So the slope indicates the direction and steepness of the line, and intercept is where the line crosses the y-axis, just as a quick recap. Now let's take a quick look into how linear regression actually works. So the core idea of linear regression is to find the best fitting line through the set of points, but for which prediction error are as small as possible. So for this, first we need to define what error means in linear regression. So let's say the blue points, as we mentioned before, is the actual points itself. And then our linear regression comes up with a line that is this red line that exists between this point. And now let's take a sample x. Let's say we pick an x here, and we just extend to see where that hits. So as per linear regression, the predicted response lies somewhere here, but then the actual response that should have come is this blue dot here. So there is a gap between the predicted response and an observed response, and this is usually error. Now we pick only one point in input, that is an x-axis. To find a general error, what we do is we go over all the points. We take the difference between actual output and predicted output and then square them so that we eliminate negative values. The equation of the line is y equal to mx plus b. Therefore, the parameters influencing how this line fits are the slope m and then the y-intercept b. So if we change this m and b, the line would also change, and we can maybe minimize the error. So I will not dwell a lot into mathematics, but then this is generally how we come up with an optimization algorithm. So we would like to minimize the error, and to find a minimum value, usually we take a derivative to find the minimum point in the cost function. The cost function is basically the error itself. So we substitute the cost function, that is actual y minus predicted I, and then we square it. But also we take the gradient along the slope, because the slope is what we would like to first optimize. And then we do some essential mathematical tricks. Y prediction is essentially mx plus c, or b itself. B and c are same here. And then once we expand this and substitute the term, this is how the minimization for linear regression looks like. So we use the gradient to adjust the slope. So now let's take a simple example and understand better. So if you remember in the previous video, we already saw an example. So consider this as a data set, which is essentially a CSV file that has a lot of columns. So we have certain addresses, we have zip codes, we have the prices, the areas, rooms, and we also have the longitude and latitude. One thing to know here is if we need all this data. So we already mentioned for regression, you only need numbers. So we can only predict numbers, and therefore the input should also be numbers. And therefore, what we would do is first remove all the other unwanted columns and only keep the price, area, room. And then we would build a linear regression model and then come up with prediction. Let's go to Synera and take a look at a workflow for this. So this is our data set. So as you can see, this is, like we mentioned before, this has a lot of addresses, zip code, and everything. what we do is we go to Synera, and you can download this workflow to see how we do linear regression in Synera. So the first step is to